Okay. Okay, Ken and Chassy, if we could just begin by asking your name and where you're from.
I'm the Reverend Canon George Chassy, an Episcopal priest residing in Columbia, South Carolina. I'm retired from the active ministry, and prior to that time, I was the canon administrator for the Diocese of Upper South Carolina.
Did you grow up in South Carolina?
No, I'm a native of Massachusetts.
Massachusetts. Okay.
But I've been in South Carolina now for a number of years.
Okay. So you're a transplant by now. You're an honorary local by now.
Absolutely. Actually, we moved south out of Massachusetts in 1947.
Ah, okay.
To Florida and then to South Carolina.
Right. If I could just ask you, before you went into the Air Force, what sort of work were you doing?
I was a student.
You were a student. Okay.
This was back years ago.
Yeah.
And I was a student at a state college there in my hometown of Bridgewater, Massachusetts. Mm-hmm. And I enlisted in the Air Force right after Pearl Harbor. Mm-hmm. In fact, I still got that date indelibly imprinted in my mind when I enlisted, which was the 29th of December, 1941.
Mm-hmm. So you remember Pearl Harbor was a very vivid.
Oh, yes.
Where were you when you heard the news?
Well, I was with my fiancée, who is now my wife, and if I recall, we were down at the local drugstore having a Coke when word came that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor.
And so within a few weeks, you signed up.
Right, I left college and signed up.
Where were you sent initially?
Well, we took our oath in Boston, Massachusetts, and then we went to Fort Devens out in western Massachusetts, which was a military establishment similar to Fort Jackson that was established prior to World War I. And from there, I was shipped to Jefferson Barracks, Missouri, and then from there to Hamilton Field, California. And it was at Hamilton Field that I finally, in 1942, I was assigned to the outfit that I remained with until the end of the war.
Mm-hmm. And where did you see action in Europe?
We went to England first, and I was in a fighter group. I was a crew chief in a P-51, and we first flew fighter escort for the 8th Air Force bombers from England over into Germany. When the invasion came, we were the first fighter group to operate out of the Normandy beachhead, and in fact, I went to Normandy and I landed at Omaha Beach on D+11 in 1943 and 44. Yeah, 44. And then we went from there down into Brittany, and from Brittany went across France to a place outside of Paris, was a little town called Saint Dizier, and from there we went down into near Nazi France, and from there we went into Germany and went to Ansbach, and from Ansbach we went to a place called Herzogenaurach, which is a little town, but it's most famous now because it's the headquarters for one of these manufacturers that manufactures sports shoes. Adidas, I think it's Adidas. Really? Anyway, but it was a little small town there, and so that's where we were when the war ended.
When you finally went over into Germany, how did it feel for you to be beyond German territory?
Well, you have to understand that in those years, the great villain of the world was Adolf Hitler and his whole crew, along with Tojo in Japan. And for those of us that were young and that age, the great victory was to get on a German soil in order that we could defeat this great enemy of democracy. And prior to that time, we had participated in several campaigns that had led us to this point. And one of the interesting things about our fighter group is that our tactical mission was to fly air support for Patton's Third Army, and which was an interesting experience in itself. But to get on German soil, I mean, we were beginning to achieve the kind of victory that we were there to do. I mean, it was a great mission. I mean, to defeat what was perceived correctly as a great enemy and a great evil power. I mean, that was simply out to enslave the world.
As an American military man, had you heard any rumors? Had you heard any information? Was there any discussion about what was going on in terms of the treatment of the Jews?
Not as I recall. I don't recall any of it while we were stationed in England or in France. I remember as we got down closer to that period of time when we would begin to push on across the river into Germany, that there would begin to be conversations about this, and little things would be picked up. But when we got down deep into Germany, especially when we took up our first station in Ansbach, then it was we began to hear more things. I mean, because the Allied troops would begin to reach some of these places, and that's when we began to realize that there was more to this to what was going on than we had realized.
So you then had heard rumors from previous troops that had gone in,
yeah.
and what do you remember? What your reaction was? What did you think about these things? How did you feel about these rumors you were hearing?
Well, at first you'd say, one human being can't do this to another human being. I mean, it's incredible, that this could happen. But I was a student of history before I enlisted, and I'd kept up with things. But for me personally, when I began to connect things that they had done when Hitler first came to power, what they'd done to Jewish merchants and Jewish families and other things, you began to say, hey, there is a possibility of this, but until I see it with my own eyes, if I can, I mean, I'm going to reserve complete judgment until that time. But I brought this along when I picked this up in our air base in Germany, and this sort of symbolizes what that whole era was like, and like I told you before we began here a few moments ago, this is not a stage prop. This is a real thing, which I keep to simply to remind me, I mean, of what can be. I mean, it is not a great witness to man's humanity, but to man's inhumanity.
Let me take you back to your mentioning that until you saw it with your own eyes. Let's get to that point in the story. Where were you when you came across the camp? Tell us that story.
It was in the early spring of 1945, and we were, as I said earlier, stationed at this air base, which was a former German base in Ansbach. I remember one thing, if I might diverse me,
Sure.
remember one thing about this base that we liked so much. It was a fairly permanent base, and we were in a brick barracks with tile showers, and it really was pretty good living, considering we'd spent most of our time in tents and pup tents up to that time.
So that was pretty luxurious.
That was sort of luxurious. But anyway, we had two of our fighters that on a mission were forced down at at really an abandoned German strip up north of Ansbach, up in the vicinity of Erfurt, and Erfurt is not far from Weimar, and if you remember any of your European history, there was that short-lived democratic attempt called the Weimar Republic that existed in Germany right after World War I. But so this was right near Erfurt, and there was several of us were dispatched up there with 2 replacement propellers, and all we needed to do this. And it was quite a trip, and it's too bad I can't show you on a map. But anyway, it was quite quite a trip from Ansbach up through, because we were passing through the Allied forces that were moving up towards the front all the time. I remember the date specifically because on this journey we learned that Franklin Roosevelt had died. And so we arrived at the place, and we repaired the 2 aircraft that we had to repair, and got them operating again, and they flew back to base. And since we had some time, we thought we would look around, see what we could see in that part of Germany. And at that moment, one day, I think it was a British colonel came through and had mentioned that there was a concentration camp not far from there. And we said, let's go see what we can do. And it was in Ohrdruf, which is a very small town south and west of Erfurt. So we took off, and I can still remember as we approached this town, there was just the pall and a sense of death around, and I've experienced this before. If you go through a town like St. Lo that's been thoroughly bombed and beaten into the ground, and there's still a body buried under the rubble, there's a certain odor and that permeates the air. And this was what we experienced as we approached the village, and the concentration camp was out from the village some ways. And we went there and drove through the gate and got permission to tour the facilities. Now, as I got the story from one of the American officers there, the German people in the village said, we did not realize this was happening. We did not know this was going on. We thought this was some other kind of facility, but
they had, and those people, they had already told that to
yeah.
And so you were told that that's what their reaction was.
The American commander says, I want every able-bodied person in the village to come up there. I want you to see yourself. And they were given the task of removing bodies and the remains of those that had been cremated and laying them out. Unfortunately, the pictures I was able to take that day, it was a cloudy day, and they don't show up well on the camera, but they're here. I mean, and you know, as we looked at before, it shows and laid out and what they are, and I've labeled them that day that I got them developed.
When you first entered the camp, do you remember the very first thing that you saw?
Yeah, I saw all these remains wrapped in sheets being laid out, just hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds. They were being laid out for burial.
And that was the first. That was the first sight that greeted you.
First, yeah, and it was a whole series of one-story buildings that were scattered around, and there was a big barbed wire fence, and there were the typical gun towers and all of that. And we began to wander through this facility, and what I remembered and what I was told, I'll try to relay to you so that you can get the picture. I mean, there was one of the things they did was to take at various times the able-bodied men of the camp, along with those that were not so well. They'd take them out into the woods, and they would cut a lot of timber, and then they would execute by machine gun fire or other means. And you could tell it was machine gun fire because some of the bodies had it across the chest. Execute them, and then the able-bodied ones would stack them up, a layer of bodies, a layer of coal with a layer of bodies up, probably a funeral pyre 30 by 30 by 30, and soak it down with gasoline and burn it, and then they laying across this place was all these long pike poles that they used to mix it up so they get the burning well. There was another place where they did execution by hanging. There was another place that they would stack bodies. They had so many bodies they couldn't get rid of them. They stacked bodies and sprinkle it with lime and other things like that, and that's how they tried to get rid of them. And that's basically what you saw. I don't recall now what they did at that camp, whether it was any manufacturing that went on, of any small manufacturing, or whether it was just a plain prison. I don't recall whether there was any gas ovens there or not, but they could have been, but I don't recall that.
Now, you'd heard some kind of vague rumors about previous to your entering Ohrdruf. When you actually saw these things, were you prepared for the reality, even though you had heard rumblings about what was going on?
No, you're not prepared. You're not prepared to see hundreds and hundreds of people that had been put to death. Their only crime either that they were Jewish or that they were Polish, but weren't of value anymore. I mean, it was an incredible experience to see how human beings, I mean, creatures of God, I mean, had been used as things simply for the so-called establishment of a master race.
When the townspeople were rounded up to come and look at what had been done, were you part of the detail that brought them back?
No, no.
Do you know how that was done? Were there German speakers in the unit who came and got them, or?
I would assume that I can only assume that there was American military government officials that did that. We were not part of the force that was controlling the camp. We were not part of the force that liberated it. We simply appeared there and was given the opportunity to view what had happened.
How long in all were you there? How much time did you spend there?
Oh, half a day.
Half a day. And how long then did your unit remain in that area?
Oh, it was shortly after that our detail, which was simply a very small temporary force that went up for a particular mission. We left and went back, Nansbach, in a couple of days.
And when did you eventually come back? Because that was pretty shortly before the end of the war. When did?
Yeah, we went from Ansbach, then we went to we moved to Herzog and Orach shortly after that, and then the war ended, and I was fortunate that I had the opportunity to attend the University of Paris. So I spent the summer of 1945 at the University of Paris under a special arrangement between the French and American government for
the
American
GI Bill.
troops. Mm-hmm. Well, it was prior to the GI Bill, but it was an excellent opportunity. And then I came home in September of that year and came back to the States almost 2 years to the day that I left.
If I could just take you back a bit, did you actually encounter any survivors when you were in the camp? Were there still any inmates there?
That I can't recall. My impression is that the survivors had already been taken to hospitals in other places, but I could be wrong.
Okay. What the men, your fellow, the men from your detail, your unit, do you remember any discussions that you had when you came across this? Did you share what was going on, or?
The main thing was there wasn't much talking. I mean, this is incredible. It's incredible. We don't believe that people could do this. I mean, and to many of us, I know of that detail. And this was a small group from my fighter squadron. To many of us, this was validated all that we had done in terms of the war, the invasion, the whole thing.
Yeah, it was very concrete then. It was right there. When you got back home, finally, after those very eventful 2 years, did you talk to friends and family about what you'd seen there?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and that's why I've still got those 2 photographs. I mean, I've showed them around. And so I used to teach history. And in fact, I came to South Carolina to teach American history at Rock Hill High School. And when we got to World War II, I used to use the same story, and same pictures and same illustrations.
Do you remember the general reaction? Were people incredulous when you told them this? Were they? Do you remember in general what kind of feelings you're telling the story elicited in the listeners?
Many said, we cannot let that happen again. Many said, I just don't believe people would do that, and others just said, well, I've wondered, and this affirms what I've wondered about.
Yeah. How did you then eventually get into the ministry after your teaching stint?
Well, that was a long story. I think part of my experience in the war brought me this, and not some thing that says I'm going to save the world by being a clergyman. I mean, not that, but I do remember that one of the things in my mind was that I really wanted to spend my life however I could, building lives instead of destroying lives, and to affirming people instead of using people, and so education was one way, but then I sort of got led into the Episcopal priesthood, and I'm glad I did.
What effect did that day in the middle of April 1945 have on your life then?
Well, I think, I don't want to be on a soapbox kind of thing, but one of the things that I've said at times has been on Ash Wednesday. On Ash Wednesday in the Christian tradition, we traditionally sign people with the sign of the cross made of ashes. And I've used the comparison is that ashes on one hand, and tell this experience of this concentration camp. This is a sign of man's inhumanity to man. I mean, it's a sign of the depravity of humankind if left to their own devices without some guidance and help, primarily from outside themselves. And on the other hand, ashes in the Christian tradition, in the sign of the cross, is also a sign of the affirming of God's love for the world. I mean, and so you get these two contrasts, and that our task, it seems to me, is to labor in such wise and in such ways that we don't allow, I mean, that kind of racism and that kind of using people to explode out of hand. And the German people, many of them are just as at fault with they were at that time. I mean, and many of the church, but there were those also that were on the other side. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a Lutheran clergyman, who was hanged about this same time in April in a concentration camp because of his stand against it.
Sorry, I wasn't able to hear you, Rose. Okay. If I may ask, Canon Chassy, have you experienced, in your experience, have your fellow clergymen discussed things that you've been just discussing right now, the meaning of the Holocaust, or what lessons it can teach, or has this been something that, in your experience, has come up through the years?
Well, it's I've never sat down with. There's been times when I know that, and with other clergy people, that we've talked about various things where I have brought up my experience and what it means in terms of man's relationship to himself and to others. But we have never sat down and talked about the Holocaust per se.
You know that there's a very large group of people who, out of either ignorance or through the revisionist movement, don't believe that the Holocaust happened, believe it's all a hoax or a myth. As a former teacher of history, are there a few words that you might like to say to somebody who would come to you and say, I don't believe it, that's a myth, that's a hoax, that's just Jewish propaganda?
I would say it did happen. And just briefly, I mean, that I'm here to witness to the fact that I saw the results in one place of what had happened, and that and to say that it's a myth, I mean, is to distort history. That I have the evidence both imprinted in my mind and in my heart, and on these pictures, that it was there and it was something that took place. How many were lost? I don't know the numbers, but I know that this concentration camp at Odra, you don't read about it like you read about some of these others, Auschwitz and Dachau and these others, but there were many of them there, and this is one, and this is the experience of this person at that place.
Ken, Chassy, I'd like to thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Okay, Rose? Okay. You did very, very well.
Oh,
excellent, excellent. Because I've talked to a number of people, and
hold on just a second, because you have that.
Oh, wait a minute. I'm walking off. I'm walking off with your microphone.
that happens all the time.
Because I might shoot the
If you'd like to shoot that map that you brought along.
Oh, okay.
So you need to do, I guess, whatever needs to be done to do that. Maybe you can even point.
Yeah, I'll point it out.
we're going to shoot the map while he's in the chair. Of him pointing it out.
Yes.
Is it in Greenville about the diocese, the upper diocese for the upper part of?
Point him out and kind of like tell us what it is or whatever. Okay.
Ready? All right. This is Ansbach. This is the base we first went to when we came into Germany. That was a permanent German Luftwaffe base that we occupied. Shortly thereafter, we went over to here to Herzog and Orach. That's where we were at the end of the war. But the concentration camp that I told you about is up here at Odra, which is just outside of Erfurt, which is a major German city, and just west of Weimar, which was the headquarters of the old German Weimar Republic. But this is the little town where they had that concentration camp.
Okay.
Got it?
Okay. And we're going to have you unfold the armband once again, and we're going to get a picture of that too. And I'll take this. I kind of got it in the shot, but they want to make sure they have it.
Okay. Fine.
I'll put it.
High school students get a big fascination out of this, you know. You want me to say anything?
Okay. Let me
Do anything?
let me tuck your mic back
Okay.
in here, just the cord.
All right.
And then when you turn it, as long as like the camera can
Okay.
see, that's
All right. Oh, yeah. Do I have to say anything?
just rolling it on tape right now.
Don't have to say anything at all. That's good.